Can you imagine it? A well-dressed black man, composed and silent, sitting in the first-class cabin, only to be treated like an outsider simply because he didn't fit the familiar mold. They didn't ask questions. They didn't check tickets. They simply ordered, "Stand up. Someone more important needs that seat." But what they didn't know was this: that man, Malcolm Reed, was the new owner of the very airline they were working for. And with just one cold call from the cabin wall phone, everything came crashing down. $500 million vanished in less than 10 minutes. An arrogant empire collapsed right before their eyes. Malcolm Reed didn't need to raise his voice. He only needed the truth, and to let it speak for itself. If you think this is just another story about injustice, stay with us, because what happens next goes far beyond anything you could predict. This is a story about justice, about resurgence, and about how a single individual can transform an entire system through sheer resolve. If you're ready to step into this emotional journey, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe so you won't miss any more powerful stories. Now, let's begin. 6:48 a.m. at Ellington Skyport. The rhythm of a new day hummed like a symphony of haste. Suitcases glided over marble floors like the breeze. The clicking of high heels echoed like the ticking of time. The scent of expensive Italian coffee lingered in the air, like perfume for the elite. Malcolm Reed didn't hurry. He never did. He walked with the calm assurance of a man who already owned half the air inside the terminal and was considering buying the rest. His footsteps made no sound, yet somehow commanded the space around him to yield. He wore a charcoal three-piece suit, crisp white shirt, no tie, the open collar deliberate. No jewelry, no bodyguards, no entourage. Only an unshakable aura that made people turn their heads. In his left hand he carried a black leather bag, worn slightly with age, signaling authenticity rather than pretense. In his right hand a first-class boarding pass, Orion Flight 907 to Geneva, Seat 1A. Malcolm had thought long and hard before taking this flight, traveling alone under the alias M. Rivers. Not to draw attention, but to observe, firsthand, the operational culture of the airline he was finalizing a $500 million acquisition of. No presentations, no boardroom meetings, just the raw, unfiltered reality. Malcolm's instincts had always told him culture ran deeper than balance sheets, and today he was about to be proven right. As Malcolm approached the jet bridge, the ticket agent glanced briefly at him and his boarding pass. "Mr. Rivers, first class." "You're all set," she said without looking up. Her voice was polite, but her demeanor was cool. Clearly, in her mind, Malcolm didn't fit the profile of a VIP passenger. Malcolm smiled gently, said nothing, and boarded. The first-class cabin glowed softly with warm gold lighting reflecting off polished wood and muted leather seats. The quiet hum of luxury wrapped the space like a silken cocoon. The occasional clink of crystal glasses and the soft settling of leather were the only sounds. Malcolm walked slowly toward the front, toward Seat 1A. But when he arrived, he paused. The seat was already occupied. A middle-aged white man lounged comfortably in a smoke-gray designer suit, legs crossed, champagne flute in hand. He looked as if the seat had been custom-made just for him. One hand scrolled his phone, the other lazily swirling the champagne, as if in his private office. Malcolm glanced at his boarding pass again. 1A. He turned to the nearest flight attendant, a tall blonde woman with an icy demeanor. Her name tag read Claire. "Excuse me," Malcolm said calmly. "I believe that's my seat." Claire gave him a quick, slicing look before offering a tight, insincere smile. "Sir, I'll need you to step aside. There's been a last-minute change. That seat has been reassigned." She didn't ask his name. She didn't check his ticket. She simply assumed. Malcolm stood his ground. "I didn't receive any notice about a seat change. This is the ticket I booked and paid for," he said, still polite. Claire leaned in slightly, lowering her voice as if she were doing him a favor. "We received a priority request from a platinum partner. We appreciate your understanding." She gestured toward seat 7C, still in business class, expensive, but not where Malcolm belonged. He raised an eyebrow. "And who made that request?" His voice wasn't sharp, but it demanded an answer. Claire hesitated, then tilted her head toward the man lounging in 1A, Mr. Stephen Mallory, a long-time investor, highly influential. The name was familiar. Malcolm recalled several financial scandals, particularly the one where Stephen had been secretly recorded mocking diversity hiring policies as branding gimmicks. And yet, here he was, given first-class priority without question. Claire added, almost proudly, "Mr. Mallory flies with us weekly. This time he specifically requested that seat." Malcolm showed no expression, but something tightened in his gaze. "So," Malcolm said, voice steady, "your company can strip a confirmed seat from a paying passenger simply because someone influential asked." Claire held his gaze a moment, then shrugged. A small, weak gesture, but clear. "Sometimes we have to prioritize our most valuable guests." Her words were sweet, but the meaning was brutal. Malcolm wasn't considered valuable, at least not in their eyes. Around them, nearby passengers began to notice the tension. Some avoided eye contact. Others watched intently. A man in 2C leaned over and whispered to his wife. Malcolm didn't raise his voice. He didn't cause a scene. He simply reached into his inner jacket pocket, pulled out his phone. "I'd like to speak to the flight manager," he said coolly. Claire's smile faltered. "There's no need to escalate, sir," she said quickly. "There is," Malcolm replied, dialing. The cabin seemed to freeze. Malcolm's steady gaze hung in the air like a blade. Claire moved closer, now only a step away. Her voice was sharp beneath the veneer of politeness. "Mr. Rivers, I must insist you move to the reassigned seat so we can continue boarding." Still, she hadn't asked for his boarding pass. Still hadn't called a manager. Still hadn't verified anything. She had simply assumed he would comply, as so many black passengers had learned to do over the years, choosing silence to avoid becoming a problem. But Malcolm Reed was not that man. He stood firm, no tension in his posture, yet utterly immovable. Claire flicked a glance toward the jet bridge, signaling. Soon, a second flight attendant appeared, younger, less hardened. His name tag read Logan. Logan looked from Malcolm to Claire, hesitation on his face. "Is there an issue with the manifest?" he asked quietly, only loud enough for them to hear. Claire didn't answer directly. She muttered, just loud enough for Malcolm to catch, "Not now, just observe, dismissive, wrapped in procedure." Logan looked uneasy, but said nothing more. Around them, the first-class passengers were no longer pretending not to see. The tension was no longer subtle. It had become personal. A woman in 3B leaned over and whispered to her husband, "Probably just some guy using miles. They're stricter now about upgrades." The man didn't even look up from his tablet. Startup type, trying to fake it till he makes it. They didn't speak loudly, but they wanted Malcolm to hear, and he did. Claire, mistaking Malcolm's silence for surrender, extended a hand. The gesture was soft, but the command was sharp. "Sir, please step aside. This matter is no longer up for discussion." Her voice was hard now, the hardness of someone who believed the rules were always on their side. Malcolm inhaled slowly. "Let me be clear," he said, voice calm. "You're removing me from the seat I paid for without explanation. without verification, simply because someone you deem more important wants it? Claire hesitated, about to say something, but Stephen Mallory, without even lifting his eyes from his screen, drawled lazily, "Don't take it personally, buddy. Sometimes you gotta know your place. It's not personal." His voice wasn't loud. The contempt laced in every word made it ring louder than any shout. Malcolm turned his gaze to Stephen, then slowly back to Claire. She looked away. A soft beep broke the moment as another passenger boarded. Claire seized the opportunity. "If you don't comply, I'll have to call security," she warned. "No apology, no compassion, just an ultimatum." And that was the line. Malcolm exhaled, a slow, razor-sharp breath. "Then call them," he said, voice so low and steady that the entire cabin seemed to shatter like a glass dropped onto marble. Behind him, Logan took a tentative step forward, his eyes darting between Claire and Malcolm. He opened his mouth to speak, but Claire's sharp glance froze him. "Not your place, Logan," she snapped. "Stay out of it." Logan's face blanched. He lowered his head and backed away. Minutes later, 2 airport security officers boarded the plane. They looked at Malcolm, then at Claire, waiting for instructions. She gave none. She didn't need to. Her silence was the verdict. "Sir, please come with us," one of the officers said, gesturing toward the rear. Malcolm swept a calm gaze across the cabin. No passenger spoke up. No one protested. No hand raised for justice. Only eyes, embarrassed, curious, a few even gleeful, followed as he lifted his bag and walked down the aisle, flanked by the uniforms. His posture never slumped. His chin never dropped. But every glance he felt on his back was like an electric shock along his spine. The shame still burned hot, but it didn't crush him. It awakened something, sharp, silent, and surgical. As the engines began to rumble and the plane prepared for takeoff, Malcolm opened the Orion Airways in-flight magazine and pretended to read. But his ears were focused elsewhere, toward the curtain separating business class from first class. Behind it, Claire stood in the galley, speaking with a male flight attendant Malcolm hadn't noticed before. Their voices were low, almost whispers, as if no one in economy could hear. They certainly didn't expect the man they had just forced back to be so close. Claire's voice sliced through the background noise, sharp and cold. "I know it wasn't perfect, but it was a direct order." Stephen demanded that seat. "And when someone like him demands something, we don't say no." The male attendant answered, voice low and bitter. "You didn't even check the manifest," Claire scoffed. "You saw him, didn't you? Be honest. Do you think the company wants someone like that sitting next to Stephen? Or the board?" Silence, heavier than the vibrations of the plane. Each word landed like shards of glass against Malcolm's skin. Someone like that. The weight of the phrase made Malcolm clench his jaw. It wasn't just personal, it was systemic. Not an isolated lapse, but an embedded strategy wrapped in professionalism and policy. The male attendant muttered something else, barely audible. Legal risk, public image, reseating justifications. Claire whispered back, "Just get through the flight. If he complains, they'll bury it, like last time." At that moment, Malcolm understood. This wasn't random. It was calculated. A silent machine programmed to protect prejudice, all behind polite smiles and automated systems. But what surprised Malcolm didn't come from the crew. It came from the man sitting next to him, an elderly white gentleman, probably in his 70s, wearing a classic suit with an Orion Airways loyalty badge pinned to his lapel. He hadn't said a word during the boarding chaos. But now, without looking up from his safety card, he spoke evenly. "Last month, they did the exact same thing to a young man." Malcolm said nothing, waiting. He sat next to me, first class, polite, quiet, full ticket. 10 minutes later, the crew reassigned him to economy without explanation. When I asked why, they said, "Upgrade error." He paused. Funny, isn't it? Those errors never seem to happen the other way around. Malcolm turned slightly, studying the old man's sharp, clear eyes. "And then?" Malcolm asked. "Nothing. No one said a thing. And you know why?" The old man turned, locking eyes with Malcolm. "Because everyone's more afraid of making things awkward than of injustice." Malcolm leaned back slightly in his seat. He didn't need to ask more. "You worked for them?" Malcolm asked. "Board advisor? I stepped down 2 years ago. Too much silence, not enough honesty." The man nodded, his voice suddenly softening. "I recognized you. Reed Ventures, right? Heard you speak once." Malcolm didn't confirm. He didn't need to. The man already knew. "Didn't expect to see you here," he said, "among the rest of us." At that moment, the engines roared louder. The plane lifted off the runway. But Malcolm's mind wasn't on altitude. It was on patterns, on a company that didn't just allow injustice, but built a system to sustain it. He thought of Claire, not as an enemy, but as a cog in a machine that recycled old programming under polished surfaces. Behind the glossy polish of first-class luxury, a fracture was spreading, and Malcolm Reed could feel it, as surely as he could sense the static pressure before a storm. Then it happened. From behind the curtain, Stephen Mallory's voice rose, loud enough that it could not be mistaken for an accident. "I don't care how much he paid," Stephen sneered, speaking to someone nearby, his voice dripping with disdain. "Having someone like that sitting nearby ruins the entire feel of the cabin." His words sliced through the air, not just an opinion, but a challenge hurled at anyone who might dare to object. "This is first class," he went on, louder, "not a charity auction." The words cut through the polished quiet like a razor, exposing the raw, ugly truth beneath the surface. The entire cabin fell utterly silent. No flight attendant intervened. No passenger protested. Silence became an accomplice once more. Malcolm didn't react outwardly, but the pen in his hand froze above the page of his notebook. Stephen Mallory, the man who once mocked diversity initiatives, had now laid bare his real beliefs, proudly, crudely, without fear of reprisal. Inside the galley, Claire pretended to inventory the meal trays, but she was really staring at her tablet, at a private message flashing on the screen. It was from Patrick Nolan, the flight manager. The message was blunt, surgical. "Keep first class clean. Protect the image. No mixing. We've been flagged too many times this quarter." Claire's throat dried. Those words, so explicit, were the unspoken policy she had heard whispered for years, never written down, but always enforced. Now they were right there, documented. She looked up and locked eyes with Logan, the young attendant, who had clearly heard Stephen's words too. Logan's mouth opened slightly, as if to say something, but Claire quickly shook her head, a fierce warning in her eyes. Once again, fragile compassion was crushed under the heavy machinery of silent obedience. At row 12, Malcolm closed his notebook and shut his eyes for a moment. He didn't need to hear more. Stephen's voice still echoed in his mind, each word like acid eating away at any pretense of civility. But the most damning realization wasn't Stephen's drunken arrogance. It was Patrick's message, the final puzzle piece. Every suspicion, every policy, every insult dressed as procedure, now confirmed. The phrase "protect the image" wasn't a preference. It was a strategy, cold, calculating, explicitly deciding who was allowed to be seen and who must be rearranged to maintain comfort. Malcolm's breathing stayed slow and steady, but behind his closed eyelids a fire smoldered, quiet, steady, and unstoppable. This was no longer about a seat, it was about a legacy, and about an opportunity to ignite the leverage he had quietly been building for months. At the front of the plane, Stephen Mallory reclined further into his seat, smugly swirling his champagne. He wasn't whispering anymore. "People should know their place," he declared loudly. "Money doesn't make you high class. Bloodlines do." His words weren't aimed at anyone specific, and yet they were aimed at everyone. A few passengers chuckled awkwardly. Most looked away, pretending not to hear. Stephen leaned toward the woman beside him, a prim, cold-looking mid-level executive, and said just loud enough for everyone to catch, "Pretty soon these flights will feel like subway rides. Can't even keep first class clean anymore." The woman didn't respond. She simply sipped her drink. Her silence wasn't disagreement. It was permission. In row 13, a middle-aged black woman leaned toward Malcolm and whispered, "Did he really just say that?" Malcolm nodded slightly. "He did, and that's not even the worst of it." The woman sighed. "They don't even bother hiding it anymore." Malcolm's voice was calm, almost clinical. "They don't need to. The system protects them. Not anger, clarity, because the facade had finally crumbled. It wasn't random. It wasn't accidental. It was by design. As the plane glided silently over the Atlantic, the tension thickened. Some passengers kept sneaking glances at Malcolm, torn between guilt and hesitation. Logan, the young flight attendant, passed by twice, each time slowing, as if he wanted to say something. But fear sealed his lips. His guilty, apologetic eyes said more than words ever could. Halfway across the ocean, the curtain parted again. This time, it wasn't Claire. It was Patrick Nolan, the flight manager. He strode down the aisle with a stiff, rehearsed smile that barely masked his tension. He knelt by Malcolm's seat, an image of fake concern. "Mr. Rivers," Patrick began, "may I have a word?" Malcolm nodded curtly. Patrick continued as if reading from a script. "We've received complaints that your presence has made some passengers uncomfortable." He said it like a simple fact, as if feeling uncomfortable had become a weapon. Malcolm clenched his jaw, but kept his voice level. "Really? What exactly did I do to cause discomfort?" Patrick didn't blink. "Your presence in the business class cabin after the seating incident has created a tense atmosphere. Some passengers have reported that you were taking notes, whispering with staff, and causing unease." Malcolm gave a dry, humorless chuckle. "So now silent note-taking is disruptive?" Patrick remained expressionless. In the interest of safety and comfort, he said smoothly, "We've decided to divert the flight. We'll be landing at Lansbury Airport for a security check." Within minutes, the loudspeaker crackled. "Ladies and gentlemen, due to a minor issue, we will be making an unscheduled landing at Lansbury Airport. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened." Shock rippled through the cabin. A man 2 rows behind Malcolm muttered, "They're really throwing him off the plane?" Another whispered, "Over a seating mistake? Unbelievable." But this wasn't about a seating mistake. It was punishment. It was warning. Logan passed by once more, slowing, this time stopping entirely. He opened his mouth, but Patrick's sharp glare froze him in place. Malcolm rose when asked. He gathered his notebook and jacket, calm, composed. Phones began to appear, shaky hands filming quietly, unsure if they had the right to capture the injustice unfolding. A young college student seated near the partition didn't hesitate. She lifted her phone, pressed record, and tracked Malcolm's steady walk down the aisle. "They're throwing him off," she whispered into her phone, voice trembling. He didn't yell, he didn't fight. He's just being pushed out for existing. Her live stream exploded. Hundreds of viewers, thousands, hundreds of thousands, over 1 million before the plane even touched down. Hashtags began to trend. Justice for Malcolm. Flight 907. Orion fail. The video of Malcolm walking silently between two uniformed officers quickly became the center of a global firestorm. No name was attached yet, but the story had already spread like wildfire. In the private area of Lansbury Airport, Patrick Nolan made a critical mistake. As Malcolm was being escorted discreetly through a side door by local security officers, Patrick turned to them and muttered, careless and disdainful, "Handle it quickly, before he makes a scene." One of the British officers, a tall man in a reflective vest, glanced at Malcolm, then back at Patrick, smirking. "The calmest person here is him, mate." Back on Flight 907, after Malcolm was removed, the tension didn't dissolve. It thickened into a heavy, suffocating air. What had once been polished luxury was now a cracked mask, revealing raw, unfiltered injustice underneath. At Seat 1A, Stephen Mallory sank deeper into his seat, lazily swirling his fresh glass of champagne. His smirk widened. Outside the windows, the sky turned a heavy gray, but no cloud could compare to the darkness beginning to descend over Orion Airways' reputation. Stephen cast his gaze around the cabin, speaking loudly enough for half the rows to hear. "Honestly," he said, voice dripping with sarcasm, "this flight feels much lighter without that atmosphere." He twirled the champagne glass between his fingers, continuing, "I pay for first class to enjoy peace, not to share space with people who bring courtrooms on board." Nearby, passengers stiffened, some glancing awkwardly at each other. A few turned away, silent. Stephen chuckled, adding with theatrical innocence, "Of course, it's not about race. It's about class. Some people simply don't know how to behave." Further back, Logan, the young flight attendant, worked mechanically, his hands trembling. Every word Stephen spoke seemed to carve a deeper scar of shame across his face. Unable to bear it, Logan slipped behind the galley curtain where Claire stood pretending to busy herself with snack carts. He whispered urgently, "Did you hear what he just said?" Claire didn't even look up. "Stay out of it. Do your job." But Stephen Mallory wasn't done. Drunk on the power he believed unshakable, he lifted his glass in a mock toast. "Here's to keeping the natural order intact, forever." At the same time, the young college student's live stream had crossed 2 million views. The internet exploded across Twitter, Reddit, TikTok. Justice for Malcolm. Flight 907. Orion fail. Stand with Malcolm. Meanwhile, Stephen remained blissfully ignorant. In his mind, the online world was just noise, powerless against the fortress of wealth and privilege. But outside the insulated walls of Flight 907, a storm was gathering, fast, furious, and unstoppable. After the ground crew finished refueling and securing the cargo, the cabin lights flickered briefly, then stabilized. A strange transmission buzzed in the crew's communication channel. Only Patrick Nolan could hear it. He tilted his head, pressing his earpiece tighter, his face shifting from suspicion to pale alarm. Without a word, Patrick hurried toward the cockpit. At the same time, Claire's phone buzzed violently in her pocket. She pulled it out, scanning the urgent notification. Breaking. Black executive forcibly removed from Flight 907 first-class cabin. Allegations of racial discrimination emerge. A photo accompanied the headline. Malcolm Reed, calm and composed, standing between two uniformed officers, his tailored suit immaculate. The image was already everywhere. Claire's hands trembled. She glanced around the cabin. Everything looked the same, but the air had changed. Everything was different now. Everyone except Stephen seemed to sense it. He remained oblivious, sipping his champagne, wearing his victory like a crown. Then the curtain snapped open, and Malcolm Reed stepped back into the cabin, not hurried, not broken. Standing tall in his flawless suit, Malcolm carried himself not like a man expelled, but like a force reclaiming its rightful place. The cabin collectively held its breath. Stephen shot up, sloshing his drink. "You again? Didn't they escort you off?" Malcolm didn't answer immediately. He let the silence stretch, heavier and heavier, before speaking, voice cold and razor-sharp. "You're mistaken. Silence isn't weakness, and what you, and this airline, have done won't quietly disappear." Stephen laughed dismissively, trying to reclaim his swagger. "You think you have any power here? Do you even know who I am? I could buy half the people on this plane." Some passengers looked away, ashamed. Others, cautiously, turned their gaze back to Malcolm. Malcolm slowly reached into his inner jacket pocket. He pulled out a sleek black card, the platinum logo gleaming under the cabin lights. No name was necessary. Those who recognized it understood immediately. He held it up, his voice level. "You don't need to know who I am, but Orion Airways does." The cabin fractured in stunned silence. Stephen stammered, "What is that? Some joke?" Malcolm's words dropped like hammers. Not a joke, a fact. Near the galley, Patrick Nolan had just returned from the cockpit and froze mid-step. He stared at the card, then muttered under his breath, face draining of color. Valora Capital. The realization struck like lightning. Patrick whispered again, almost inaudibly. Valora Capital acquired controlling shares in Orion Airways 2 days ago. Malcolm let the silence drag a moment longer before walking calmly to the cabin wall phone. He dialed swiftly, speaking low but unyielding into the handset. "Read here. Activate the emergency withdrawal clause. Freeze all Orion Airways transactions. Report to the Investment Alliance Board. Prepare breach of contract litigation." He paused, then added, his voice slicing through the air. "They tried to humiliate their new owner. They will pay for it." He hung up without ceremony. Around him, every eye in the cabin was locked, frozen, disbelieving. Stephen Mallory, the once smirking Titan, now shrank visibly in his seat, swallowing hard. Claire stood paralyzed by the galley, eyes wide as the gravity of what had just happened crushed down upon her. Even Logan stood rooted in place, stunned by the seismic shift unfolding before him. This was no longer a confrontation. It was a seizure of power, right before their eyes. Malcolm placed the phone back on its cradle as casually as if he had just ordered room service at a luxury hotel. Then he turned, locking eyes with Patrick Nolan. His voice cut like ice. "You stripped me of my seat, denied my identity, and upheld a racist system disguised as corporate protocol. And for that," he paused, letting the weight settle, "you will lose far more than just your job." Patrick opened his mouth, but no sound came out. His earpiece crackled urgently. He pressed it tighter, listening, and with each passing second his face drained whiter and whiter. The message from headquarters was curt and merciless. Emergency legal alert from the board. Priority immediate. At the front of the cabin, Stephen Mallory, still struggling to grasp the situation, stammered, "You're doing all this for revenge?" Malcolm turned fully toward him, voice steady and devastating. "I'm telling you, the airline you thought served you." He leaned in slightly, punctuating every word, "now belongs to me." The cabin froze. Passengers gaped. Some gasped audibly. Malcolm continued, voice unwavering. Valora Capital secured 51% controlling interest in Orion Airways 2 days ago. I signed the final acquisition papers in Geneva. I kept my identity hidden on this flight, to test the culture firsthand. His gaze flickered briefly toward Claire, who now stood rooted, unable to move or breathe. "You didn't even ask my name," Malcolm said softly but fiercely. "You assumed I didn't belong. You displaced me without verification, and you enabled blatant racial discrimination in broad daylight in the heart of first class." Claire's voice cracked. I was just following the receding protocol." Malcolm's reply was swift, merciless. "That protocol is a smokescreen for prejudice. And now? It's been live-streamed, documented, and tied directly to a shareholder lawsuit." A soft ding sounded. The cockpit door opened. Captain Rivers, the senior pilot, stepped out, impeccably uniformed, face stern. He walked directly to Malcolm, stood straight, and said formally, "Mr. Reed, we have just been informed of your position and ownership rights. On behalf of the flight crew, I sincerely apologize." Malcolm gave a small, controlled nod, but his eyes remained glacial. "Apologies are only the beginning," he said. "The brand you're serving was never real luxury. It was exclusion wrapped in polish." Meanwhile, far beyond the walls of Flight 907, the shockwaves spread like wildfire. At financial hubs from New York to London, investment alert systems lit up crimson. Legal teams were flooded with urgent calls. Emergency board meetings snapped into session. Screens at trading floors flashed urgent headlines. "Internal crisis at Orion Airways following CEO seating incident." In less than 10 minutes, Malcolm Reed's identity flooded news channels. Black CEO forcibly removed from seat on airline he secretly owns. Valora Capital triggers emergency penalties against Orion Airways. Markets reeled. Bloomberg's ticker rolled in red. Corporate disaster at 30,000 feet. Discrimination leads to $500 million sell-off. CNN followed. Business catastrophe in the sky. Racism sparks financial freefall. At airports, televisions switched from sports coverage to breaking news reports. CNBC played looped footage from the students' live stream. Malcolm's quiet walk down the aisle juxtaposed against the free-falling stock ticker of Orion Airways. Social media erupted. "Stand with Malcolm. Flight 907 crisis. Orion collapse." A viral tweet from influential investor Shah Laram summed it up perfectly. Never underestimate a black man in a tailored suit, especially when he signs your paychecks. Inside Orion Airways' Manhattan headquarters, panic exploded. Phones rang off the hook. Legal departments scrambled. Executives tried, and failed, to contain the hemorrhaging. Some tried to reach Malcolm Reed to negotiate, but every call went unanswered. Others tried to halt the market collapse, but it was already too late. Valora Capital wasn't merely pulling out their investment. They were gutting Orion Airways. $280 million in infrastructure deals canceled. 5 international hub agreements voided. This wasn't just money. It was the lifeblood of the company's global operations, and it was bleeding out, in real time, before the world's eyes. Back on Flight 907, Claire had disappeared. She hid in the galley, slumped against a cold metal supply cart, eyes glued to her phone. Her own face now circulated endlessly under brutal headlines, the face of corporate shame. Near the cockpit, Logan, the young attendant, stood frozen. He clutched a tray, staring toward Malcolm's seat with a mixture of guilt and awe. Patrick Nolan, drenched in sweat, stared blankly at his tablet. Another grim update flashed across the screen. He stumbled back toward the cabin, barely able to speak. Finally, he managed, "Ladies and gentlemen, We have received updated directives. The flight will proceed directly to Geneva, immediately. No one clapped. No one cheered. The moment for hollow platitudes had long passed. Stephen Mallory, the once proud Titan, stuttered weakly. There must be some misunderstanding, but even he no longer believed it. Malcolm didn't even glance at him. He reopened his notebook, scribbled a single line, and shut it with cold precision. There was no triumph, no celebration. This wasn't about revenge. It was about correction, reconstruction, sweeping away rot to build something stronger. Across the aisle, the young college student, who had bravely live-streamed the incident, stood and raised her phone high. Her voice rang clear. "I just want to say, this is what justice looks like." Patrick Nolan stiffened near the galley. Every new update in his earpiece was another hammer blow. Emergency legal review initiated. Immediate personnel investigations ordered. Internal inquiry launched. Claire never returned to the first-class cabin. Her absence wasn't a tactical decision anymore. It was pure survival instinct. The crew had realized what had just happened wasn't just a disruption. It was a turning point. Irreversible. The plane began its descent toward Geneva. The cabin lights brightened gently. The captain's voice came over the PA, unusually cautious, as if one wrong word could trigger another viral storm. Malcolm Reed sat calmly in seat 1A, exactly where he was meant to be. His notebook was closed. His phone was silent. Because the real blow had already been delivered before the wheels even touched the ground. At the terminal, 3 dark-suited legal officers boarded the plane, badges from Orion Airways' internal investigation team pinned prominently. They didn't look at the flight attendants. They didn't acknowledge Patrick Nolan. They walked straight to Stephen Mallory. One of them, voice flat and merciless, announced, "Mr. Mallory, by formal notice, all your rights, privileges, and affiliations with Orion Airways and its global partners are hereby revoked. Your flight history will undergo full review under international compliance protocols. You are now subject to immediate investigation." Stephen's mouth opened and closed, but no sound came. He fumbled for his belongings with shaking hands. A silent security officer stood behind him. No intimidation, just finality. The cabin watched in breathless disbelief as Stephen Mallory, once a roaring lion, stumbled out of first class like a broken man. No violence, no shouting, only absolute humiliation. Next came Patrick Nolan and Claire. As the disembarkation process began, 2 more investigators appeared, flashing their credentials. Claire froze at the sight. She didn't fight. She didn't protest. She knew. Her career hadn't crumbled from one mistake. It had collapsed under the weight of years of accumulated silent prejudice, finally dragged into the light. Patrick, desperate to salvage anything, stammered, "It's just a standard compliance review, right?" The investigators handed him a blunt, emotionless letter. "Immediate suspension, pending investigation into discriminatory conduct, policy breaches, and failure to follow incident escalation procedures. No arguments, no appeals. The system that once shielded them had turned its full weight against them." When Malcolm Reed disembarked from Flight 907, a small, tense group awaited him at the gate. Not reporters, not a crowd of admirers, but senior managers, airport partners, and emergency PR teams, their faces stiff with fear. Leading them was Lena Caro, the newly appointed Vice President of Crisis Management for Orion Airways. Her voice was steady, but filled with dread. "Mr. Reed, on behalf of the company, I extend our deepest apologies. We acknowledge grave misconduct on this flight. An immediate internal investigation is underway. Personnel have been suspended." Malcolm didn't respond. He simply walked past them, silent as a winter storm. He didn't need their hollow apologies. He had already taken everything that mattered, the world's attention and absolute leverage. Behind him, passengers disembarked in near silence. Gone were the easy smiles and casual luxury. Everyone was still reeling from what they had witnessed. A retired lawyer from Brussels began typing the first lines of a new article. The day real power boarded the plane. Meanwhile, the student live streamer had passed 8 million views. Major news networks scrambled to buy broadcast rights for her footage. In VIP lounges around the world, CEOs scribbled frantic notes. Competitor airlines called emergency meetings. HR departments launched overnight audits. And in New York, dozens of executives who had once built Orion Airways' exclusionary culture found themselves staring down imminent investigation. In the days that followed, the aftershocks of Flight 907 weren't confined to aviation. They rippled across the entire corporate world. What had begun as silent discrimination had become an explosive case study, a devastating lesson in systemic failure, collective arrogance, and unexpected justice. But beneath the outrage and resignations, something deeper also stirred. Hope. Change. It didn't start in the boardrooms. It didn't start in PR offices. It started in one quiet, trembling heart. Logan, the young flight attendant who had remained silent too long. 3 days after landing, Logan, the young flight attendant, posted a handwritten letter on social media. The handwriting was shaky, but the message was clear. I should have spoken up. I knew what they did was wrong, but I stayed silent, afraid for my job. That was cowardice, and I take full responsibility. The letter spread like wildfire, not because of scandal, but because of its raw honesty. In his post, Logan also announced the launch of a new initiative, the Crew Equity Fund, a legal and financial support fund for minority airline staff facing discrimination or retaliation. The closing line stunned everyone. This fund is seeded with my entire first 6 months' salary, because silence has a cost, and I choose to pay it myself. Malcolm Reed didn't respond publicly. He didn't need to. Within hours, Logan received a private message from the Valora Foundation, Malcolm's charity arm. We are matching your donation, multiplied by 10. Not forgiveness, not charity, but recognition that real change begins with those willing to face hard truths. Meanwhile, the wider world continued to shake. Stephen Mallory, once untouchable, lost almost everything. Investors pulled funding from his private equity ventures. He was blacklisted from elite boards and clubs. Media outlets unearthed a mountain of past scandals and discriminatory comments, things once swept under the rug. The man who once boasted of being high class by birth now found himself isolated and disgraced. 2 weeks after Flight 907, a blurry photo surfaced on Reddit. It showed Stephen, in worn jeans and a faded jacket, carrying boxes into a small Brooklyn community center. Some assumed it was a PR stunt, but more photos emerged. Stephen cleaning floors, serving lunch, attending workshops alongside former inmates and housing activists. Journalists confirmed it. Stephen had quietly started volunteering full-time at Equal Footing, a non-profit organization Malcolm Reed had secretly supported for years. In a rare statement issued through Equal Footing, Stephen wrote, I once believed money defined worth. That power created identity. But when those illusions were stripped away, I wasn't destroyed, I was freed. I was wrong. Not just on that flight, but in how I lived before it. If there's a way back, it's not to save my reputation. It's to reclaim my humanity. The public remained divided. Some doubted his sincerity, but many recognized this rare truth. There was no blame-shifting, no finger-pointing. Stephen had done something most fallen elites never dared. He owned it. Elsewhere, real structural change was unfolding at Orion Airways under Malcolm Reed's quiet, relentless leadership. Recruitment practices were overhauled. An anonymous reporting line for staff was established. Customer service protocols were rebuilt from scratch, tying executive bonuses directly to diversity and equity scores. But the biggest transformation wasn't on paper. It was cultural. Pilots, flight attendants, ground staff, people who had once learned to stay silent, now found their voices. They shared what they had witnessed. They told the stories they had buried deep, and they began building a new standard, not from fear, but from conviction. Malcolm Reed never held a press conference, never gave a self-congratulatory interview. He simply continued working, quietly, methodically, turning personal insult into systemic revolution. 1 month after Flight 907, a small ceremony was held inside a private hangar at Newark Airport. No media, no grand speeches, just 30 people, airline crew, equity advocates, and corporate reformers. There, Logan, the once silent young attendant, stood on a makeshift podium, voice trembling with emotion. He introduced a new award, the Malcolm Reed Leadership Award, honoring individuals who advanced fairness and integrity within corporate cultures through courage and principle. There are injuries that don't leave bruises, injustices that don't draw blood, just a cold look, a dismissive gesture, a system rigged to deny your existence. But there are also people, like Malcolm Reed, who choose to answer not with anger, but with resolve, not with violence, but with vision, not with noise, but with undeniable action. He didn't just reclaim his seat. He reclaimed the dignity of everyone who had ever been silently pushed aside. He made the arrogant kneel before the truth they tried so hard to bury. And above all, he proved, true power isn't who shouts the loudest. It's who stands unshaken when no one else dares to speak. If this story touched you, made you reflect, or shifted how you see justice, leave a like, share it widely, and subscribe for more powerful stories. Thank you for staying until the end of this journey. Always remember, one quiet act of courage can change an entire world. See you in the next story.